this might be of interest to people in the Mexican community, particularly because it's a system that was devised to alleviate suffering in another country. So without further ado, let me start by telling you a few housekeeping notes. One, if you have phones on, could you please put them on vibrate? That way it doesn't disturb the proceedings. There are several things in here I will be discussing, but I'm not going to make it too boring. I hope I want to tell it as a story, which I hope will be interesting to you. So, to talk about the Galveston movement, we need a little bit of background. For instance, the succession of presidents in the United States starting around 1900. If you look at page 1 of your handouts, one of the slides says quick presidential facts. A quick historical facts first. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but the Republic of Texas was formed in 1836, annexed to the Union in 1845. So we were an independent republic for a good many years. The state of Texas was formed in 1846. Civil War period, 1861 to 65, the Spanish-American War, 1908 to 1901. The Galveston storm is relevant to us because that's where the story begins. It's Galveston. But I'll tell you just in brief about the Galveston storm and how it's relevant to our story as we go along. The movement itself was from 1907 to 1914 only, so it was 7 years, no more than 7 years. It was very interesting the way they conceived of it and why they conceived of it and what they did in order to move people away from the more densely populated areas. Okay, going back to the presidential facts, William McKinley was elected president in 1900, and Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president. But McKinley was assassinated in 1901, and Teddy Roosevelt became president. So he served out the rest of McKinley's term, which was almost 3 years. And then he ran for president again in 1904, was elected, so he was president for another 4 years. During his term, halfway through his term, he appointed Oscar Strauss as Secretary of Commerce and Labor. Now this was a big deal because this was the first Jewish American to be ever appointed to a cabinet position. Howard Taft was elected president in 1908, who was groomed by Teddy Roosevelt to be his successor. So Howard Taft was kind of following along in Teddy Roosevelt's footsteps most of the time. By 1912, when the elections took place, Woodrow Wilson was elected president. And we'll talk about how some of that affects the events that I will relate to you fairly soon. So I'm going to give you a very short little overview of what Galveston was like when they selected it to be the port of entry. And we'll talk about why they selected Galveston at a later point as well. So Galveston was chartered in 1839. It was a major seaport west of New Orleans. It was the most sophisticated city in Texas, believe it or not. It was bigger than Dallas and bigger than Houston, and it was home to many firsts, including the first golf course, the first hospital, the first all kinds of things, country clubs, and they were very good at attracting the population of Texas to go down there for the summers. Obviously, it was a beach town. So Galveston was a happening place in the 1800s. They had a bunch of Jews who had already settled there. They were mostly traders. They came very early to settle. They came with the charter almost. And the Jews had their first cemetery in 1852, the first synagogue, B'nai Israel, in 1868, and I have a picture in your handouts of Temple B'nai Israel. Their Rabbi Cohen, who plays a very important role in our Galveston movement, was their third rabbi. There were two rabbis before him at B'nai Israel, but Rabbi Cohen, I'll tell you very briefly a little bit about his background. He came from England. He was British born and raised. He went into the rabbinate in England. England had what they called a chief rabbi for the whole country, and they still do, in fact. And he was, Rabbi Cohen kind of chafed under that because he wanted to have his own ministry, as it were. And under the chief rabbi of England, he had to do whatever the chief rabbi said to do. So he decided he was going to go elsewhere. So he first came to a small congregation somewhere in the deep south, and he was there for about a year or two, and then he saw this advertisement for the congregation in Galveston looking for a rabbi. He was very young, and he decided he was going to come to Galveston. And he became a legend here because he lived out his whole rabbinate in Galveston. His children grew up there. He pretty much was a legend in Galveston, in the Jewish community and even outside of it. He worked very closely with the Catholic Church. You might be interested to know, particularly because most Mexicans are Roman Catholic. He was a very good friend of Father Irvin, and they worked together in the relief efforts after the hurricane came to Galveston in 1900, a very devastating hurricane. So there were people drawn from different communities and different walks of life to work on the relief committee, and Rabbi Cohen was a very, very big part of that. So what percentage of Jews do you think Galveston had? 11%, which is higher than any city now has in terms of percentages. 11% is a large number. In Dallas, I think we're about 6, fraction of that, about that. So the numbers have never really gone into the double digits. Sorry?
I think we're more like 2 or 3%.
Oh, is that low? Yeah. So in Galveston, it was 11% in the 1800s. And so what was happening on the other side of the world? If you look at Europe, this was the late 1800s. We're talking about Eastern Europe now. We're talking about Russia. When I say Russia, though, it included what we now think of as parts of Poland. It included the Ukraine, and Pale of Settlement was where the Jews were supposed to live. It's very complicated to explain all the details of it, but suffice it to say that the Jews had to live in something called Pale of Settlement, which was a designated area within the empire that they were not allowed to go out of. And they were restricted to certain trades and occupations which they had to follow. They were not allowed to do everything that a non-Jew could do. Even though they were free, they were not really free because they were living in this small area. They lived very rural existence. One of the pictures I have there shows a marketplace in one of what we call the shtetls, which is a village where the Jews lived. Of course, there was forced conscription of boys, which Deborah referred to briefly in her introductory remarks. Some boys were conscripted as young as 14. So in researching this, I found out that a lot of young boys that came to Texas or came to this part of the world came by themselves alone when they were 14 years old. Can you imagine 14-year-olds coming and making a go of it? I mean, they did pretty well for themselves, which is amazing. But many of them did this before the Galveston movement, before it was an organized way to get them here. So where did they come in general? In the 1800s, most of them came to New York's tenements. They lived in New York's tenements because that's where their relatives or their uncles, aunts, or families were told them that there's a lot of Jews in New York. It'll be like living in the old country, so go to New York. So that's where most of them ended up going. And the interesting thing is that the New York tenements, and I have a copy, picture in your handouts on page 3, were these high-rise buildings, maybe 4 stories high. But each family had a room, 5, thank you. Each family had a room or a few small rooms, and they were very small, and loads of people lived in there. It was not a very good situation to be in. But they felt at home because it's where all the Jews were. Many of them had carts, push carts. They were peddlers. In New York, it was push carts. Here, it was wagons when they finally got here. But in New York, it was push carts, and you saw push carts, if you see pictures from those days on the streets, and they're selling fruit, and they're selling everything you can imagine. And that's what they were good at, because they did that in their home countries. They were good at trade, they were good at manufacturing. I had this little slide on page 3 that is kind of hard to decipher because it's kind of small. But if you look at that closely, it talks about the percentages of Jews and non-Jews that belonged in certain occupations. And it's interesting that certain occupations, Jews are very highly represented, and others, they're not so much. So there weren't a lot of Jewish farmers, but there were a lot of Jewish merchants. There were lots of Jews in commerce and manufacturing, but not so much in some of the other areas where you would think it would be evenly distributed, but it wasn't. So that's why I have that. I'm sorry it's so small. This actually was supposed to be, or used to be when I first did it, a PowerPoint presentation. So you saw the slides one by one on a big screen, and it was a lot easier to see. Anyway, so considering that conditions in New York were so bad, and people were living in very close quarters, and things were getting a little bit difficult for the people who had come before. And I'm not talking about, more affluent Jews who lived here longer, who came from different migrations 2 or 3 generations ago. They felt that this was not a good situation. They wanted to do something to alleviate it. So there was one gentleman in particular who paid close attention to what was going on, and his name was Jacob Schiff. He came as an immigrant at age 18 from Germany, and he made a very successful life for himself. He went into the banking industry, and he was responsible for making decisions on various big companies that we are now familiar with, among them AT&T. He was very influential in floating loans to railroads to get the railroad started, to build railroads connecting the various parts of this country. So he had a really big picture of what was going on in the country. And he also had the wealth to back some of his ideas. So his idea was, and he sat on various committees, among them, I need to give you the exact names, so I'm going to refer to my notes very quickly. He sat on various philanthropic committees. Among them, there was the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Welfare Board. Now, these were organizations that had been set up in New York to look after New York Jews, particularly those that were not very well off. And what he did was he created, or along with Baron D. Hirsch, they created a fund in 1891 with $2.5 million to help New York Jews. Jacob Schiff sat on the board of trustees of this fund. So working on these boards and working with these committees started to give him some ideas for how he could get people to not live in these congested areas. So he decided that first he was going to try and move people out of New York to other areas in the United States. Well, once someone settled in an area, and they've got friends, and they've got people from their old hometowns, they're not moving, right? So he found it was very difficult to get people to move out of New York once they came to New York. So he decided, okay, there's got to be another way. So his brainwave was, don't let them go to New York to begin with. Let's find a way to get them to come from Europe directly to another port, somewhere away from New York, so they have to settle elsewhere. But in order to do that, you have to have a network of organizations. But luckily, the Jews are very good at organization building. They have organizations everywhere. They have one for looking after the indigent, they have another one for, promoting something else, and they have organizations everywhere. All you have to do is put them together. So he started to think about how they could put this together. Now this was a huge task. Consider this. They were coming from Europe, from Russia. They were going to come to Germany. From there they were going to get on a boat and they were going to come to Galveston. That was his plan. But trying to get people or recruit people in Russia to come that route instead of going to New York was going to take organization. So the first thing he did was print leaflets or had an organization that was already there on the ground in Russia. Print leaflets. Let me tell you the name of this organization. If you go, let's see, to the next slide, page, on page 4, I've drawn some diagrams for you. And I'm going to start by going through each of those diagrams with you to tell you how these organizations and the coordination worked. So in Russia, there was this Jüdische Immigrationsgesellschaft. I'm not great at Yiddish, so if someone knows different pronunciation, please correct me. That organization was tasked with recruiting people who wanted to come to the States anyway, to come through Galveston rather than go to New York. So this organization was not just in the Russian Empire, it was in Poland and Lithuania and anywhere in that general Russian Empire. Russian Empire was huge, right? And then they had to be sent from Russia to Germany, where Bremen was. That was where the port was. So in Germany, they had an organization called the Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden. Is that correct? And they were responsible for taking care of the people that were coming through from Russia and living in Bremen until they shipped out. But the organization that got them from Russia to Bremen was a British organization called the ITO, the Jewish Territorial Organization. Here's where Rabbi Cohen comes in. Rabbi Cohen was from England, and he had a friend who went to school with him by the name of Israel Zangwill, who was an English playwright, and he had some ideas about settling Jews in their homeland, not in Israel, somewhere else. So he was looking for a homeland in South America or Africa, and what Rabbi Cohen and Jacob Schiff did was convince him to send people to Texas instead of to Africa or Latin America, wherever he was going to send them, because they already had something here that we could distribute Jews and they would be happier than they were in the Russian Empire. So Israel Zangwill, his organization was the ITO, and they were responsible for bringing the people from Russia to Germany. Okay, so we have 3 countries now, plus Jacob Schiff in the US, and Rabbi Cohen in Galveston, and they're all working together to make this all happen. In the US, there was one organization in New York called the IRO, which was set up by Jacob Schiff. Okay, I need to tell you what it was. It was called the Industrial Removal Office, and this was the one that was set up to try and get Jews who lived in New York to move to other parts of the country, but obviously not too many people wanted to move. So using that same organization, he decided he was going to have, since he was New York based, Jacob Schiff, he decided he was going to use IRO to work through and try and get some people in Galveston to work with the IRO. So as time went on, he set up another organization in Galveston called the JIIB, which is the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau. And this one was headed by Rabbi Cohen, because Rabbi Cohen spoke many languages. One thing I didn't tell you in his background was, when he was in England, they already learned more than one language in England. They always learned French and maybe another language. But he also went to South Africa because his older brother lived there, and he went there for 2 years, and he picked up a bunch of African languages. So he had a ear for languages. This was very good for him when he was working with the immigrants from Russia, because he had a good ear, and he could understand languages, and so he made everyone feel at home. So he was in charge of JIIB, along with a committee of people. And what he did, he was responsible, I mean, he had a finger in every pie pretty much. He did everything. He would go to the court and everything, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me tell you what happened from here. So, all of these organizations are going to be working together, right? Just to put it all together. The JIIB advocated the use of the port of Galveston and sent pamphlets to Russia, which were distributed in Russia by the Russian organization, which is the Jüdische Immigrationsgesellschaft. Then the ITO, which is the British organization, is helping the Jewish immigrants get from Russia to Bremen in Germany. And once they're there, the Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden is going to care for those immigrants and put them on ships that are bound for Galveston. Then, once they put them on the ship, the list of passengers and their occupations, this is very interesting. They knew what each of those immigrants was good at, what they did for a living, their occupations, their age, their names, their hometowns were sent by a telegraph to JIIB in Galveston so that they knew how many to expect once they arrived. So it took 3 weeks for the ships to get from Bremen to Galveston. They were small ships, and I have a picture of a ship over here. The Lloyd Steamship Company was also involved in this because they did not have direct service to Galveston, but because of this whole program, they decided that they were going to go straight to Galveston. So they may have stopped in Philadelphia or New York or someplace, but the Galveston town people had to go all the way to Galveston. So the steamship company, the Lloyd Steamship Company, helped in this endeavor as well. And then once they got to Galveston, there was Rabbi Cohen, taking care of them, making sure they had a good place to stay. And the JIIB had already done a bunch of legwork. The JIIB had a guy called Morris Waldman, who was their, you could say, executive director of the JIIB. And he was actually a social worker. He traveled all up and down the country, mostly in, north of Texas, by train, and looked at labor conditions in every town he went to. Looked for Jewish communities, networked with Jewish communities in all the towns up and down the railroad corridor, and talked to Jewish agencies wherever he went. B'nai B'rith lodges. He found that they were already teaching English to immigrants. He found that they were teaching occupational skills, and they were sponsoring relief programs for those who needed a little helping hand. So what he did was he built bonds with these organizations in every city he went to and tried to get a promise from them to take immigrants when he got them in Galveston. So now we have the railroad involved. We have organizations in other cities involved. And the interesting thing is that he knew what occupations these people had, right? And he got the telegram from Bremen. So what he did was, he had a list, having gone through this whole journey. He had a list. Kansas City needs a butcher, Kansas City needs so many shoemakers, it needs, blacksmiths, whatever. And when the list came in, he would say, okay, this family, they have this occupation, they're going to that city. And before they got there, they would have a railroad ticket all set up for them, and they would have a place for them to go. So they weren't stuck here. Once they got here, they weren't staying in Texas. The idea was to move them out into the Midwest. So they went all the way from Texas to Minnesota. All over the place, because he had done his legwork, because he had worked with all the Jewish organizations along the way. And they were never a burden to anyone, because the Jewish community looked after its own. So they were always taken care of. When they got to Galveston from Bremen, there was a hot meal waiting for them, there was a bed waiting for them, there was paper so they could write to their families as soon as they arrived. You know, this was snail mail, and it took as long as the ship to get messages home, but that's how it was. And if they didn't have enough money, they were given some money, but not a lot. You didn't need a lot in the 1900s, right? So they would send them on their way, but most of them stayed maybe a day, and the next day they were on the train going somewhere else. The ones who stayed in Texas mostly stayed because they had family here. Now, they didn't stay in Galveston. Most of them went other places. There were a bunch who went to Bay City and Beaumont and, you know, all these little towns. Waco had a few. There was a town called Sango, right? There were a bunch that went there. They were all over Texas. Houston had a few. But they did not stay in Galveston. In fact, Galveston's numbers are probably fairly small, considering that families came to Galveston to begin with. But they mostly went out. Within Texas, I'll give you numbers at the end, but within Texas, not so much. They all went to other states. Rabbi Cohen took such a personal interest in all of this that he came across a passenger who was in dire straits, and his plight affected him so personally that he wrote a letter to President Taft. And since that didn't work, he made a trip to Washington and spoke to President Taft, and Taft said, "My goodness, you're going to a lot of lengths on behalf of a co-religionist." And Rabbi Cohen says, "What co-religionist? He's a Greek Catholic." So it didn't matter to him, you know, what religion the guy was. If he was meeting a ship and there were non-Jews on the ship and they were in need of a helping hand, he helped out. So we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on during this time. I told you the movement was 1907 to 1914, right? So all of 7 years. So what should we be talking about in terms of legislation and what was going on in the country at that time? I'm going back a little bit, but the Naturalization Act was passed of 1870, that was the first one. Then the Act of 1891 established the Commissioner General of Immigration in the Treasury Department. And there's Philip Sargent, who held this position for a while. But the Naturalization Act of 1906 revised the one from 1870, which was the original one, and it established a standard form which required immigrants to show proof of entry upon applying for naturalization and to list names and details of wives and children. In addition, it required immigrants to learn English in order to become naturalized citizens. So when I talk about some of this, I'm going to be referencing party affiliations, but only because it's relevant to my story. The crux of the matter is, when bureaucrats were friendly to Jews, things went really well. When they were not, times were harder. That's normal. People are at the core of everything. So if you have people who are sympathetic to a certain cause or are willing to help, things will go smoothly. When they are obstructionists, then things won't go so smoothly. So people are at the core of this story. Oscar Strauss, I mentioned, somewhere in 1906, after President Taft was re-elected president in 1904. In 1906, he nominated appointed, thank you, Oscar Strauss as Secretary of Labor. Now, Oscar Strauss was Jewish, the first cabinet level position a Jew had ever held. And he was friendly. He already knew Jacob Schiff, so he was willing to listen to him. And so Jacob Schiff was able to get some things done because Oscar Strauss was his friend. For instance, Jacob Schiff asked for Strauss's help in getting a bill passed in Congress to authorize construction of a new immigration station in Galveston, which there was not before that. So in 1906, that happened. And then things went fairly smoothly except for 1909 when there was a recession in the country and, jobs were scarce and Jewish communities up and down the corridor were not willing to take new immigrants because they didn't have jobs for the people they had in town. And then Strauss was no longer secretary of the department and things changed. Early in 1910, a new, no, this is not the secretary, but I'll get to that in a minute. There was also a new inspector in charge who arrived in Galveston. His name was Alfred Hampton, and he was what you might call an obstructionist. He had personal views, which obviously filtered into his work, and he enforced finance and health requirements to a ridiculous degree, to the point where there was a hernia epidemic with the immigrants coming through. He just diagnosed everyone had a hernia and they couldn't stay. So they were all being deported back because they had hernias. The other thing that he was finding a lot of was trachoma, which is that eye disease. So there were a higher level of hernias in Galveston. They were 10 times the rate in New York and 6 times the rate in Philadelphia. All because there was one guy in charge of this thing here. I mean, if you look at the numbers, the people are still coming in from the same part of the world, so what else could it be? So then when Strauss was no longer in the Department of Commerce and Labor, Charles Nagel became secretary and Benjamin Cable became his undersecretary. So Hampton, who was the inspector in charge in Galveston, initiated an inquiry with the department regarding the finances of incoming Jewish immigrants, and this led to the involvement of the Department of Justice and lawsuits between them and the JIIB in Galveston. And Schiff and the JIIB ultimately won all of these lawsuits because of Schiff's insistence early on and throughout this whole process that he was always going to stay within the law. He was never going to do anything that was outside of American law. So there was no wrongdoing that was to be uncovered, and so whatever lawsuits went through were won. So that was a good thing. Jacob Schiff was doing the right thing initially. So anyway, there were all kinds of cables going back and forth between Nagel and Cable and the Galveston Committee, and so Taft kind of heard about it and made some remarks at Ellis Island in October of 1910, referring very favorably to the Galveston movement because he's talking at Ellis Island and New York's already crowded. So he says, Galveston movement is doing everything right. So that automatically sets the tone for his Commerce Secretary to then be favorable to the Galveston movement, regardless of what Hampton down in Galveston is saying. So then, in 1912, there was another election. Taft goes out of office, and Woodrow Wilson comes into office. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. But under him, he split up the Department of Commerce and Labor into the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization and the Department of Labor, two separate bureaucracies. And immigration fell under labor, even though it says immigration and naturalization. But I think it fell under the Department of Labor, so the Labor Secretary was very important. And his name was William Wilson. Kind of like Woodrow Wilson, but a different William Wilson. And he used to be a former labor official and what we might call today a restrictionist where immigration was concerned. Why? He was for labor that was already here. He did not want new immigrants coming in and taking jobs, so he wanted to restrict immigration. Okay, so what happens? Every policy that was in place was enforced to the highest levels, so that immigration became much tougher for people coming in. At that point, it's now 1913, and things are slowing down because of these policies. What happens in 1914?
World War.
That's right, World War I. And what happens to shipping during that time? Not safe. Not safe. So they decided, first of all, Jacob Schiff started with a goal in mind. His goal was 25,000 immigrants coming through Galveston in 10 years. In 7 years, that goal had not been met. It was nowhere near being met. So he decided, well, the war is here in 1914. Ships are being put into safe harbors somewhere. Not a lot of ships are coming through. The policies of the government have become much more restrictive. We can't get people in like we used to, because when we do, they're sending them back for whatever reason. So he decided to put an end to the movement. But what happened during those 7 years? The people that came in, they went all over the country, mostly up and down the Midwestern corridor, all the way to Minnesota. I'm going to give you a few numbers that I found. About 3,000 stayed in Texas. This is according to Hollis Weiner, who wrote Jewish Stars in Texas, including only 300 in Galveston. Now this is interesting. 1,000 settled in the surrounding states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, and 6,000 went elsewhere across the Midwest and Far West, including 375 in Colorado. So only 300 of those original immigrants stayed in Galveston. You would think they would stay there, but they picked Galveston very strategically because it was a small town. It was sophisticated and kind of one of the bigger towns in Texas, but it was still a small town. It couldn't handle that many people. So and there was a railroad connection going between Texas and other states. So that was a big plus. And everybody went. Talk about Jacob Schiff's goal one more time. His 25,000 immigrants to Galveston his goal was not met, but he had spent $350,000 of his own money out of the $500,000 he set aside for this project, and in 7 years. So he had set aside $500,000 for 10 years, and he spent $350,000 in 7 years. And all the organizations that he put together are probably still around, most of them. And the fact that there were organizations doing relief work already, and there were organizations teaching English already, and there were organizations, teaching occupational skills for the new country, that was all already in place. All he did was have these people in Texas coordinate that whole thing. So it was quite an amazing project if you think about it. And it took a lot of skill to put it all together, and they did this in the early part of the 1900s, believe it or not. So that's it. If you have questions, I'm willing to take questions from you. Yes?
What was the total number that came for the Galveston Plan?
I thought I had a total number here. 3,000 stayed in Texas, 1,000, so 4,000 and 6,000, so that was 10,000. Yes?
$350,000 is how much today?
Oh gosh. You'll have to ask that to somebody else.
Who would know that?
Yes?
One of the reasons they went to New York was because of, the Yiddish language.
Yes.
They came on the boat and they communicated.
Right.
And learned English very quickly.
Right.
And they probably never really learned English because their lower side was so crowded that, maybe the children
Went to school.
learned English. Similar to the, other immigrants' experience.
Right.
But you didn't mention anything about the pogroms that were going on in Europe.
Yeah, that was a big reason.
Especially in 1909, there was the biggest, 100,000 Jews who perished. And that spurred
Huge migration.
huge migration.
Actually, it started in the assassination of the Tsar started out with
This
pogroms.
pogroms since
They've been before.
since 1000. In England actually started. So, Rabbi probably knew more about it, but there was a huge one in 1909.
Right.
And that's
So the massacres
and actually went to Minnesota. It's funny,
interesting.
you mentioned Minnesota.
How many went to Minnesota?
You know anything about that?
Do I know anything about it? How many went to Minnesota? I don't have that in my notes. But if you look in that article in Hollis Ava Weiner's book, there's another book written about the Galveston movement by Bernard Marienbach.
My grandfather went to Minnesota, developed his oldest daughter.
Okay.
He worked in a sweatshop up in Minnesota.
Yeah, just
long enough to get enough money to bring the rest of the family.
right. That's what they did. They sent money over, and they brought one by one more people came in. Similar to after the
They almost
Holocaust.
said we back then because in Baltimore they said that when the ship stopped in Baltimore, we thought my aunt Edith was retarded. But she was mean, but she wasn't retarded.
But on the German side, his grandfather was like a rabbi teacher, and they didn't want people who were rabbis. They only wanted skilled workers.
Sure.
And they advertised for that.
In Russia, he worked in a bank.
Yeah.
In Fort Worth, he was a peddler with a rag and picked up junk on the side of the road.
Yes.
I read Sunday's oral history the other day, and the father, their father had said, they asked me what I did, and I said I was a blacksmith, because somebody told me they needed blacksmiths. He said,
Exactly.
I didn't know what it was, but if they needed a blacksmith, I could be a blacksmith.
How long did this rabbi live?
He died in his 80s in Galveston.
Yeah.
Because I heard a story, and I bet it's this rabbi. Pre-Holocaust, there was a rabbi in Galveston who saved a lot of Jews. I bet it was this rabbi. He went to merchants, Jewish, non-Jewish, and he got sponsors for young Jewish boys to come over, like in the 30s, to save them. And he needed a sponsor, it was really restricted.
Yes.
And he needed a job for them.
But that's not the only story. I used to live in Chicago for a while, and I know a small businessman in Chicago who sponsored over 100 people. Sponsorships are expensive because you have to pay to sponsor these, and you have to be responsible for them when they get here.
Right.
And this small businessman sponsored over 100 people. This is just my personal experience.
Yeah.
And that must have happened in lots of cities all over the country.
But during Jacob Schiff's time, they had to have a sponsor as well. Because on Danny's papers, on his father's side, there's a man on the papers that he doesn't know Peter something.
Lincoln.
Something, we have no
So
idea
he's
who's
a
the person who sponsored the grandfather and the daughter.
Wow.
So we're thinking it's somebody that,
Yeah, somebody who was doing a good deed,
right,
who had the means and was
Right.
doing a good deed.
yeah.
That happened a lot. Like this
Yeah.
one small businessman I know. He didn't know all these people, but they had to get out of Europe, so he was sponsoring them.
Real estate.
Yeah. And there must have been so many others like that.
Yeah. Small pockets.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Wait.
Yes.
How soon after they were said that they had to go back where they said that? Like they just got on the ship?
Pretty
On the-
quickly, yeah. It was very quick.
On the next
turnaround.
vote?
It was very quick turnarounds. They
If-
were not processed and let to stay. Once they said, no, you can't stay, turn around.
No appeal?
Yeah, like if you go to Ellis Island, you can see the room where they kept them essentially in quarantine
Yeah.
until there was a place on a ship for them to.
Then they have to pay
They had to pay their own fare, and they had to come with a certain number of dollars in their pockets. So they had to come with some money. If they didn't have any money, they were sent back. If they had some sort of an illness, they were sent back. It was big. It was huge. And like I said, you could diagnose trachoma or hernias because nobody could see it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for June for the lecture and the stories about Galveston. It's interesting that the more things change, the more they stay the same. People are still coming for the same kinds of reasons. They're still running into the same kinds of problems, and organization. The moral of the story is the more organization you have, the easier it is, I think, for people to come through. And, you know, it's a wonderful story that's very timely, certainly even today. So thank you all for coming. If you've not seen the exhibit, we hope you will. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. It's up for another week through the 18th, and we hope you enjoyed it.